Hey y'all, I'm Emily, an almost lifelong quilter with a lot of stories to tell. I have loved quilts and talking about them for as long as I can remember, and I'm here to celebrate the tradition of quilting with you. From family heirlooms to thrift store finds, every quilt holds a piece of history and a little piece of a quilter's heart. Join me every other week to get back to your quilting roots. We'll celebrate quilts and the real people who made them, learn a little bit about the history of quilting, and have lots of fun exploring ways to reclaim tradition in a modern world. I'm so glad you're joining me this week here at Patchwork Revival. Hi friends, welcome to the Patchwork Revival podcast. I'm your host, Emily. Before we get started, just a quick introduction this week. It's going to be a little bit out of the ordinary, something new, if you will. We're going to be coming at you a little bit later than usual, simply because I had an idea for this episode and I decided to just give it time and let it develop into what it wanted to become. Quick reminder to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. If you feel inclined, hop down, leave a review for the show. I would be so grateful. Good reviews are how the internet learns to share the Patchwork Revival podcast with other listeners who may not have discovered our wonderful community yet. Of course, you can always share this episode with a friend that you would like to join here. I'm so grateful that you're here. So I'm going to just let this episode speak for itself. I hope you all enjoy it. I do recommend finding a still, quiet moment where you're comfortable, letting your mind go, using some imagination to hear and listen and absorb this story about a very special woman who loved to quilt. Once upon a time, there was a woman who lived on a large piece of land in a place where trees grew tall, old, and wise, and the grass stayed green for most of the year, and people were close to one another because there really weren't that many of them around. Many of the people who live in this place had lived in the surrounding area for almost their whole lives. They had raised children, retired from jobs, lost loved ones, and mostly had been friends with each other for a very, very long time, helping each other through good times and bad. The woman was no different. She had grown up nearabouts and had moved there when she had gotten married. There had been 4 children, now grown and gone, who had brought life to her home, and the piece of land she lived on had once been farmed so that her family had been fed. They never really had much, but they had enough, in no small part because of her willingness to see things for more than they were, and to find ways to create them into something special. There had been years of making her own bread, freezing and canning fruits of the land, shelling purple hulls and pecans, mending trousers, making dresses, and borrowing and sharing with her neighbors to bring warmth and happiness to her home. She had become a young woman in some of the harder times in history, and had been raised to understand the importance of frugality as a tool for survival. Back then, canning beans and making bread and sewing clothes and quilts had been part of life, a way to keep babies fed and farmers functioning and families warm and safe. Of course, there had also been plenty of ways she had learned to make a house a home even when abundance was lacking. Weaving a thin thread with a tiny hook into complex patterns to create a crocheted doily, stretching her bread starter discard into cookies or pie crusts, arranging unsalvageable garments or bits of fabric remnants into colorful patterns that meant babies would be both warm and beautiful. The world had changed over the last 70 years or so. Things were everywhere. You didn't even need all that much money to have a lot of these things either. It came to a point where it was more expensive to own the tools you needed to grow and keep canning fresh vegetables. And buying clothes that fit well enough cost less than the tools and fabric you needed to make a dress. In some ways, it broke her heart to see how it moved from creation people had become. But there were other times she felt grateful for a new pair of warm socks that she could simply put on to put up her feet and enjoy, knowing that bread was already in the pantry and bacon was safely plastic wrapped in the freezer. Her children had grown and begun to become gray themselves, and with each beat of her heart, she felt grateful to have witnessed their lives full of worries and joys and achievements that she felt as acutely as if they had been her own. They had each one children and grandchildren, and each afternoon, while she rocked and sipped her one luxurious post-morning cup of coffee, she felt her heart stretch to the point of bursting as she thought of each and every one of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren and said a quick prayer of thanks for their life, feeling as though she was wrapping them all up in an embrace that stretched across the whole country where they had been scattered by life. She saw many of them often, but of course it never felt often enough, because those kinds of things never do. She was old now, 96. Yes, years of living had shown her just how much people can change and just how much people stayed the same. She had grown up as one of 9 children, 2 boys, 7 girls, and now it was just her and one sister left. They were both frail and, frankly, way too infirm to be taking off down the interstate to visit one another anymore. Oh, what times they had had. It was this sister, in fact, who had been part of helping her remember the joy in making something whole from some of the more hopeless-looking pieces of fabric. They had decided to buy a quilt pattern and kit together and make it back a few decades ago, along with another of their sisters who had since passed by now. It's so funny how life had taken her on journeys and paths she never could have imagined. What started as a way to bond with her sister and take up handwork beyond embroidery and crochet had turned into a group of real, living people that she cared for and loved dearly. It started with that quilt kit she and her sisters bought. They had worked on it simultaneously, each in their own hometown, and would bring it to show each other each time they came and stayed for a weekend get-together. It had been just plain fun getting together and showing each other their progress, talking about what they had done differently from the pattern or what they had planned to do for their next projects. They took up quilting magazine subscriptions, saved patterns and projects in them, and shared ideas with each other as the years went by, and celebrated their family's milestones with double wedding rings and appliqued Christmas quilts and table toppers, even an album quilt signed by family members at a reunion. One of this woman's great prides was knowing that each of her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren had all received a quilt made by her own 2 hands. She hoped they were all using the love that she had made them in the form of a quilted throw, although she did figure that lots of them, especially the boys, would probably have them folded up in a cabinet or under bed storage, and they might not see the light of day until they were discovered someday by a future spouse. Quilting had been patched into other parts of life, too. Making quilts meant finishing quilts. And her oldest had fashioned her a giant quilting frame she could raise and lower from her ceiling in her sunroom. For other projects, a floor frame was all she needed, and that had also been built from PVC pipe, following instructions one of her granddaughters had found on the internet. Hand quilting was what she loved, and that was how she finished all of the quilts that she pieced, excepting those that she got to put up at her church's quilting group. The group had welcomed her when she first decided to become part of it, and in turn, she had welcomed many a quilter that decided to join them. They weren't a large group, but they really couldn't include all that many people, seeing as there was only so much room around a quilting frame anyway. They called themselves the Sunshine Quilters, and many of them had been quilting together for a long, long time in the parsonage building of the Baptist church up the road from her house. That church had been a community hub for many years and had seen weddings, birthdays, family reunions, baptisms, and by now, plenty of funerals. And the quilting ladies had seen a lot of it. They had been granted use of the parsonage building one day of the week, as it had become more symbolic for a church to have living quarters for a minister in this day and age. Aside from that, the building needed extensive repairs, including a new air conditioning unit, which got the quilting ladies to thinking. Each month, a new member put up a quilt to be quilted by the group. Depending on how many of them there were in a given year, there would be about 12 quilts that they finished each year, in addition to pieces that each individual woman finished on her own time. They decided to host a quilt show for their entire area and charge a small admission fee for guests. The woman set aside some personal scruples about gambling from which she strictly abstained and would never openly approve, so that they could make and finish a group quilt to raffle off for interested guests. The way she figured, it wasn't as if they were creating a bad habit, like playing poker, and the payoff for the winner was a quilt made of love, rather than just money paired with the need to keep putting it at risk to make even more. What she didn't know is that she had children and grandchildren buying inordinate amounts of raffle tickets, hoping that they would win year after year after year, with no success, until the final quilt show she would be able to attend. Her daughter finally won that raffle quilt. Over the years of hosting a successful local quilt show and many a raffled quilt, the quilting ladies were able to replace that air conditioning unit and make other repairs and maintenance efforts to keep the parsonage building up and running. For years, one of her weekly schedule highlights had been showing up for Wednesdays filled with morning snacks, stitching, laughing, storytelling, potluck lunch, and afternoons ushering in early evening by this group of kindred spirits gathered round the quilt frame. There were times when the quilting ladies just spent time together as a group of women who simply enjoyed each other's company. There was a cabin down by the pond on the woman's piece of land, and the ladies would sometimes get together there for a full day of potluck meals, playing cards, dominoes, sequence, and of course, together on the front porch and talk themselves into quiet. Other times she had them up to her house, and they would sit in the living room to do likewise. Her house sat quiet in the December of her 96th year after she took her last breath there. That house and that piece of land had seen her live, flourish, and invite others to do the same. Her home held endless memories of her life and many, many quilts that had been handed out to those she loved. The lady she quilted with held memories of her too, and told stories about her to each other and to her family, because when the love of someone you hold dear is sitting beside you in the form of 1,000 stitches, they are impossible to forget. It wasn't long before more change took hold of the quilting ladies. Change has a way of barging in, making itself right at home, doesn't it? The woman was laid to rest in the cemetery of that little Baptist church that had seen her entire life go by. And no sooner had the guests dried their eyes than they were informed that there had been a change in church leadership. The new minister just couldn't understand why a perfectly good building like the parsonage had been relegated to a group of ladies for a sewing group, and informed them that there would no longer be a place for them there to quilt together. It was bleak, and it was sad. The thing about the woman, though, is that although her body had ceased to exist, her spirit was alive and well, and she still knew that there was always, always a way to take hundreds of cut up, broken down bits and stitch them together into something that was stronger and more beautiful than ever before. And that's exactly what happened. In the wake of their loss, her family had spent time clearing out her house and making sure memories that needed to be kept were salvaged, and that the few things she had that would serve others around her were donated or sold, just as she would have wanted. Her children dealt with the partitioning of the land and the lot that the house was on. In the end, her grandson bought the house. The plan was to rent that house for a while, but there was quilting to be done and a group of women who needed a place to do it. The woman's grandson knew how much she had loved quilting and what her quilting group had meant to her and the other women who joined each week. Her love of quilting meant something to him, and he saw a way to help contribute to her legacy of caring for her community one quilt at a time. To this day, the Sunshine Quilters are creating happiness and love in this woman's house. The woman in this story is my grandmother, and last Monday would have been her 102nd birthday. I love sharing her story, and I love quilting because it is a way that I continue to connect with her. Her history is my history, and I'm thankful that I get to share some of that with y'all. Until next time, happy quilting. Thanks for being here at the Patchwork Revival. Bye, y'all.
Well, that's it for this episode of Patchwork Revival. I loved having you here with me talking all things quilty. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and leave a rave review. Also, be sure to jump down to the show notes to find links for this episode, as well as the link to my shop where you can enjoy 15% off as a podcast listener with code REVIVAL. Remember that the Patchwork Revival podcast is here to celebrate the connection made in the quilts we love. I'll see you next time.